Morgan's men were making a desperate bid to get back into Virginia. They had been trapped in Ohio for a period of about 15 days. The Battle of Buffington Island, shown here, was their attempt to cross back over into Virginia and hopefully friendly territory. Horrible scenes of mayhem and death here at Buffington Island were reenacted. Here we see some Union troops down. Here we have one of Morgan's infantrymen dismounted, heading toward the rear. More of Morgan's men in disorganized array, fighting the Yankees at Buffington Island. The stars and bars, the Confederate battle flag. Morgan's men carried this proudly into battle. Indeed, although a Civil War reenactment may give the impression of a battle, no one can actually capture the horror of Morgan's men meeting the Union troops, the horror of both sides, the death. Observe these pictures here, the expressions on the men's faces, the faces of ghastliness, the faces of terror, the faces of death. This is what real combat is really like. This is how the Civil War was. Brutal, killing men, and that's all it was. Note the expression here of this man down, wounded. Here's some Yankee troops celebrating. The Battle of Buffington Island was the high mark of Morgan's raid into Ohio. Here he was defeated decisively at Buffington Island. He was never able to cross over the river due to swollen rivers. Here his army was exterminated pretty much, and Basil Duke, his second-in-command, surrendered. Morgan would last a few more days. He would make it to near East Liverpool, Ohio, then he would finally surrender there. Here we have a Yankee uniform of the type worn by Union officers at Buffington Island. Here we have Morgan's men backed into a corner, fighting back with the Yankees. The Yankees are moving in on them now. They're disputing the crossing at the river. The Confederates are forced into retreat. This is the final part of Morgan's raid. Morgan's crossing was disputed by Yankee gunboats that had armor plating on them and were equipped with cannons and were able to bombard Morgan's men to prevent them from crossing. Here is video of the actual ford that they were trying to cross. It's high now because the Ohio River has increased due to dams, the construction of dams along the way. During this battle, Major Daniel McCook of the famous Fighting McCooks of Ohio lost his life here. He was shot. Here's a picture of the Fighting McCooks of Ohio. There were 8 of them that fought in the Civil War. Here lies Dan McCook, fatally wounded. Here's a Union gunboat of the type that took McCook to Ohio. McCook's hat. Here's a poster calling out all able-bodied men to unite against John Hunt Morgan, a picture of whom is shown in the left upper-hand corner. This is Morgan's Ohio raid, showing all the cities he hit. Here's the McCook plot in Steubenville, Ohio. Dan McCook was buried in Cincinnati, but this is the main McCook plot. Here is a cavalry flag. Note the crossed sabers, a sign of the cavalry. This is Union cavalry in this instance. They carried these banners into battle. Here we have some pikes carried by cavalry, and this would have been to cut the reins of other cavalry soldiers of the enemy. Here we have a collection of canteens. In the hot July weather that Morgan came north, these canteens would have been critical. Indeed, many a battle was won or lost on the issue of having enough water. Here we have a collection of carbines used by cavalry raiders during the Civil War. They're breech-loading, one-shot type. Here's a pistol carried by many Confederate raiders. These pistols were actually made in the Confederacy here. There were 4 types, but there are only a total of 1,600 of them ever made. So most of the weapons that were carried by the Confederate cavalry were confiscated Union pistols or pistols that they had before the war in armories. This is the Bowie knife, a favorite of the Confederate cavalry raiders. It was used for digging mainly. They rarely used swords in battle.
Gun being a cavalry officer or on a horseback, if you get caught, you were hung. That's all there was to it.
Why was that again? What was the reason?
Because this thing here has a destruction power to take out 7, 8, 9 guys at one time when they're grouped together along fence lines.
What did they? Somebody thought that was like dirty or?
Yeah, it's dirty. I mean, it's double-odd buckshot. It's like going into a modern battle, stepping into a claymore mine. You know, it just takes everything out. You wipe a whole bunch of people out at one shot.
Everything in its way.
That's right. I mean, close range here, with just a regular standard buckshot, it makes a 6-inch pattern hole. Then, after the Texas Rangers were fighting the Indians off, trying to make Texas into a civilized state, the thing was, with the old peacemaking irons, 36 caliber would stop an Indian, but it would not go through an Indian horse if an Indian was riding over, drooped over the side of his horse. But a walker, a 44 caliber walker, would go right through the horse plus the Indian, and that's why it was designed. And 2 weeks after Samuel Walker was killed, the U.S. forces put this in the military arsenal.
Hmm.
How many caliber is that?
44.
So I got a Colt.
Yeah, but see, yours is a short cylinder.
Okay.
Figures.
What the hell you on about?
He's just going to jump while he's up there.
Ready?
Okay, ready?
You ain't kidding.
Here we have a Confederate raider of Morgan's command saddling a horse. These men literally lived in the saddle during their excursion through Ohio, being chased by Northern cavalry.
You're losing everything.
The battle's going to be in the field down by the. Well, he was a good. He was a regular. So, in a cavalry horse, you don't remove the lead strap. The lead strap stays on in case I have to go down and fight dismounted. You know, you can't bridle tie a horse.
Mm-hmm.
So the halter stays on, the lead strap stays on. And if, say if I got shot, another cavalryman could come right up, pop that, and the horse and the lead's free to take the horse off the field with. So, walk ahead. Come on, walk ahead.
Music during the Civil War, ever important, always played. Music to live by, music to cry by, music to die by. The Morgan family of Kentucky had a family tradition of Southern chivalry. His ancestors served in every American conflict since the founding of the United States, and they were important in legal and military, commercial foundations of the original 13 colonies. Here is one of Morgan's ancestors confronting the British. There's a picture of Cornwallis here, the British general. Here are Cornwallis's British soldiers about to be dispatched by some of Morgan's ancestors down in North Carolina. The Morgan family tree included key business entrepreneurs involved in the commerce and agriculture of the United States. Education was stressed as well as patriotism. His father was a struggling apothecary or druggist who was also involved in numerous business dealings in Kentucky. Morgan's father dealt with cotton, slaves, horse flesh, as well as hemp. He was well-traveled, going north on business trips and even to England. His life is summed up as a middle-class farm overseer for his wife's wealthy father. Hemp bales here. Here is the railroad and the wharves for transporting the goods to the market. Important. John Hunt Morgan, by birthright, attained the status of membership in the Southern aristocracy. John Hunt Morgan was born to the saddle, as were most of his raiders. Marksmanship and athletic pursuits were a major part of his education. Morgan would later deal in horse flesh himself as a sales. John Hunt Morgan was enrolled at Transylvania University in Kentucky, but he never finished, which was a common practice back then. A lot of people didn't finish college. He was also involved in a duel while attending. After school, he pursued a business career, but due to lack of funding, chose the military instead. This statue here was erected in 1905 in Lexington, Kentucky, to honor John Hunt Morgan and his men. During the Mexican War in 1846, he was elected second lieutenant of Marshall's Kentucky Cavalry. At the Battle of Buena Vista in Mexico, Morgan distinguished himself in hand-to-hand combat against Mexican cavalry. After the war, Morgan was decommissioned and had to resume a civilian career, although he would have preferred to stay in the military. He and his family struggled to maintain the family business. The Morgans owned about 30 slaves and hired additional slaves and freed blacks. They dealt in wool, wood, horseflesh, hemp, and slaves as their primary vocation. Morgan also stayed well-versed in the military arts, marksmanship, horse maneuvers, and he was responsible for the training of local militias. He married into a wealthy Southern family with a long pedigree, and he was devoted to his wife until her untimely death from ill health in 1861. It is speculated that Morgan also liked his whiskey as well as gambling. He was a Southern gentleman through and through. Since the Morgans were involved to the hilt in the Southern slave agricultural economy, it was little surprise when the family declared for the South in 1861. Morgan would often act on his own initiative, and from the beginning he indulged in guerrilla-type raids on Yankees and other Northern sympathizers in Kentucky. Sometimes he even disguised himself in Union. From the beginning, Morgan and his men despised regular warfare, and his independence and restlessness made him a natural for hit-and-run tactics, much like his ancestor, the Swamp Fox. His preferred operations were destroying railroads, trains, message dispatches, ferry boats, and any other type of communications. Morgan was accused by pro-Northern Kentuckians of carrying on warfare in a, quote, cowardly manner, unquote, due to his Swamp Fox-type maneuvers. From the very beginning, he had difficulty taking advice or following orders of his higher-ups. Morgan was no armchair-type commander, but led the battle from the front, and once approached a Union officer in person in order to exchange prisoners. He is reported to have told the officer that, quote, he was here on a Christian errand, unquote. This incident relates to the type of chivalric personality of Morgan. On April 4th, 1862, he was promoted to colonel by the Confederate States Army due to his intelligence gathering services and his ability at disrupting enemy communications. Morgan never had any consideration for the long-range strategic goals of the Confederate States Army, but put everything into meeting the enemy. Quote, action is that for which they crave, born to the horse and revolver, restless for the contest, unquote, was what one man said of them. Eventually, that impulsive and independent quality would land Morgan and his raiders in hot water. The strategically oriented West Pointers that ruled the Confederate military hierarchy would take John Hunt Morgan to the woodshed on numerous occasions. This was later in the war, however, when it could be argued that the Confederacy was doomed anyway. For now, Morgan's star was bright. Morgan's initial command had the unity of, quote, the esprit de corps, unquote, and hence strict military discipline was not necessary to obtain favorable results. Morgan's raiders, although they were capable of fighting to some extent while on their horses, fought primarily as dismounted troops and were used as shock troops at the Battle of Shiloh in May of 1862. Shiloh was fought because of the Union's attempt to capture Corinth, Mississippi, a Confederate railroad transportation hub. The saber, despite its glamorous reputation, was rarely used by Morgan's raiders. Indeed, it takes special training to know how to use a saber on a horse so that the horse will know how to react. Morgan suffered about 15 casualties at Shiloh out of 250 men of his command. After Shiloh, which resulted in a stalemate between the opposing armies, Morgan and his command now beefed up to 350 men. These businesses and banks that Morgan raided were supposed to have been affiliated with Northern interests, but occasionally he did make a mistake and rob a Southern affiliated bank. Morgan and his men netted about $6,000 in cash from robbing a train at Cave City, Kentucky on May 11, 1862. At this time, also, Morgan began carrying a contingent of artillery consisting of 2 howitzers. Morgan was rapidly perfecting the art of guerrilla warfare, using dismounted cavalry as infantry, hitting and then running, just like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox of the American Revolution. Some were even beginning to compare John Hunt Morgan with the Confederate raider Nathan Bedford Forrest. On July 4th, 1862, his brigade, brought up to 1,867 men, Morgan departed for another raid into Kentucky. The expedition left Knoxville, Tennessee, went due west to Sparta, then north into Kentucky, heartland, right into the towns of Union sympathizers. He sent false messages over the telegraph lines to mislead the enemy and began a robust destruction of property, both government and private. Some of the damage he did was, unfortunately for the Confederate cause, property of Southern sympathizers as well. This practice undoubtedly alienated some friends of the Confederacy. Morgan was opposed by no organized resistance, but by some Home Guard militia whose fighting capabilities was questionable. During this raid in particular, he received the sobriquet, quote, the king of the Kentucky horse thieves, unquote, due to his oppressment of much-needed horse flesh. Morgan, ever the chivalrous, expressed his apologies to those inconvenienced or outraged by his raid and promised to repay damages after the war. It was rumored among pro-Southern aristocracy that Morgan's raid had alienated some Southerners and had in reality done little more than, quote, accomplish colorful circus-like amusement, unquote. Morgan's troops had proved, however, that Union troops were incapable of protecting pro-Northern enclaves in Kentucky. His first raid was virtually unopposed by any force. A force of some 3,000 Union cavalry troops were dispatched but unable to catch Morgan. To many Southerners, Morgan's first raid is seen as a high point. In fact, Morgan's cavalry, in conjunction with other operations by Nathan Bedford Forrest, had caused considerable damage to Northern political and economic interests. On the other hand, Morgan's raiders noticed a lack of enthusiasm for the Confederate cause in many of the Kentucky heartland cities. Here is a Sherman hairpin, a railroad tie bent so that it can't be used again. Later, Morgan's raiders initiated 3 more raids, tearing up the Union Railroad supply lines at Gallatin, Tennessee in August of 1862. Here's an authentic Confederate saddle. At this time also, Morgan's raiders are recorded as violating the rights of prisoners when he and his men shot down Union soldiers after a particularly brief and violent exchange. It was later claimed by Morgan's men that the Union soldiers had killed civilians. The Gallatin raid was a highlight of Morgan's career. His command had closed down a major Union supply line. The L&N Railroad, for a total of 98 days, halted Union General Don Carlos Buell, who was advancing on Chattanooga, and switched the initiative of the military operations to the Confederate cause. Morgan's men had also defeated a cavalry unit of General Buell's during a skirmish, disproving the contention that Morgan was only capable of defeating poorly trained Home Guard militia. Morgan dished out 250 casualties to the Union regulars, suffering only 25 of his own men lost. This is a railroad that Morgan disrupted. This is Don Carlos Buell here. He's tired of John Hunt Morgan, and he's sending troops out now to take care of it. But the chase won't end for another 4 more years. I say 4 more years, I meant 2 more years. 2 more years and counting down. Morgan's next big operation occurred during Confederate General Braxton Bragg's invasion of Kentucky in October of 1862. Bragg hoped to defeat a Union Army under Don Carlos Buell operating there. Bragg also hoped to encourage hesitant Kentuckians to declare their approval of the Confederate cause with money, men, and arms. Morgan's role was to disrupt Buell's communication and encourage Southern sympathizers. Although Bragg's campaign resulted in a stalemate and a retreat from Kentucky, Bragg was quick to give praise to Morgan's raiders. Bragg recommended Morgan's promotion to Brigadier General. Bragg was initially more willing to accept some of John Hunt Morgan's shenanigans because he thought they might be necessary to win the war. This was earlier in the war before the Confederate fortunes changed. Bragg said of Morgan, "Morgan and his men are of no use in routine cavalry duty." In December 1862, Bragg issued a carte blanche to Morgan in order to conduct a guerrilla operation on the enemy supply line. Morgan responded to Bragg's confidence by capturing a Union garrison in Hartsville, Tennessee in December 1862, handing the Union troops over 2,000 casualties. Here once again, destroying trail. Morgan's command at this time consisted of 2,100 troops. The Confederate dike, however, was springing many leaks, and Union reinforcements and supply lines were swelling the tide. Here was Braxton Bragg. The Union war machine was going into high gear and would make Morgan's efforts at times seem insignificant. Initially, while Bragg supported Morgan and his men, toward the later end of the war, he withdrew that support. Here we have some artillery from Confederate cannons, that the type that John Hunt Morgan and his men would have carried on their excursions. Here we have a thumb stall and lanyard. During this campaign, the weather was particularly dreary with rain, mud. In December 22nd, 1862, Morgan and his raiders set out on another raid into Kentucky, the famous Christmas raid. Morgan had remarried only 7 days before and had had little time to be with his new bride. The Union command had learned a lot, however, about protecting supply lines and had trained new cavalry units specifically designed to take on guerrillas like Morgan and Forrest. Morgan's force now consisted of 3,900 men, and he began immediately burning railroad trestles and tearing up tracks. Union General Rosecrans believed that Morgan had finally bitten off more than he could chew by attempting the raid, and he hoped to finally destroy Morgan's raiders once and for all. Rosecrans tried to capture Morgan by mobilizing his cavalry and trying to concentrate his forces on Morgan. Morgan was elusive, however, and like the swamp fox, used hit-and-run tactics to elude Rosecrans' cavalry. Morgan's, besides doing millions of dollars worth of property damage to Union suppliers and capturing thousands of prisoners, had also tied up 30,000 men of Rosecrans' force. These troops were unavailable to be used by Union forces attacking Murfreesboro, Tennessee. This tying down of Union troops by Morgan was a genius stroke. It virtually assured that Confederate forces would not be decisively defeated in the decisive major contest at Murfreesboro that was heating up at this time. Here we have pictures of Morgan's men making a Sherman hairpin, bending a rail. Here's a bridge that has to be reconstructed after the damage Morgan's men have done. picture of John Hunt Morgan. Basil Duke, his second in command. Following here will be pictures of some of Morgan's raiders, what they actually look like. Here's another man. Some of these pictures were taken after the Civil War, so some of them appear to be older men. They would have been younger at the time of the battle. These were young men out of Kentucky. They had been recruited from Kentucky. Most of them, like Morgan, from Southern families, born to the horse and revolver. Some of them had even been trained by Morgan before the war and had been acting in local Kentucky militia. Seven of these raiders would escape with Morgan later in 1864 after he escaped from the Columbus, Ohio penitentiary. Here is a type of cannon and caisson that Morgan would have carried. Here are some cannons. Here's a brief description of what it's like to charge cannon. The reason Morgan wouldn't.
Charging across there against all these cannons sitting on this rise here, while they had to be really panic-stricken or something. Otherwise, they know they'd got slaughtered coming across that open range field there. Terrible, terrible war, that's for sure. Daggone it.
Braxton Bragg congratulated John Hunt Morgan, and his rival Nathan Bedford Forrest showed here. Shortly after the Union forces were stalemated at the Battle of Murfreesboro, the Christmas raid was the high point of Morgan's career. Shortly after this, controversy would dim his career. Here we have cavalry artifacts. While initially Confederate cavalry was superior to Union cavalry, by 1863 the Union had caught up to and in some ways surpassed many Southern units. They were equipping their men a lot better and were receiving even more training than the Confederates were at this time. Meanwhile, after the Christmas raid, Morgan had returned to his headquarters in McInnville, Tennessee, where he was finally able to spend some time with his new wife, and at this time he began to fervently read the Bible also. He also mentioned at this time how the war had vulgarized the Southern economy to the point of making life seem harsh. Outside Murfreesboro, Tennessee in March 1863, Morgan's raiders were involved in a large skirmish with Union cavalry. In this fight, Morgan received heavy casualties, costing him 15%. At this time, Morgan's command had been downgraded to 1,500 men. Union General Rosecrans was able to release to the press that for the first time, Morgan had been decisively beaten. Morgan resumed his duty as intelligence gathering for Bragg's army, but it seemed he may have been, quote, straining at the bit, unquote, to get into action again. His enthusiasm would shortly result in total disaster for his command when he decided to take off through Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio in July of 1863. Morgan decided to cross the Ohio River into Indiana in June 1863 in order to strike deep behind enemy lines and inflict severe damage on the enemy. The move reflected Morgan's impulsiveness and desire for action and individual autonomy. Even Morgan's own lieutenants were astonished when he announced plans to cross the Ohio. In this expedition, which he believed was a calculated risk, 4 or 5 of his own brothers would accompany him. Morgan didn't disclose the entire scope of his plans to his superiors, asking permission to raid instead into Kentucky as far as Louisville. Bragg, the Confederate commander, approved the raid and authorized only 1,500 troops for the limited expedition. Bragg also laid conditions on his approval, these being: 1. Morgan must recruit for the Confederate Army while in Kentucky. 2. All troops in his command must be native Kentuckians. 3. If the enemy advanced on Bragg, Morgan was to return. Morgan set out June 20th with 2,500 men, 1,500 above what Bragg authorized him, and 4 cannons. The Union commanders in the area were aware of Morgan's intentions almost from the beginning. On July 4th, 1863, Morgan suffered his first casualties at Tebbs Bend, Tennessee, where he lost 75 men. At Lebanon, Kentucky, Morgan was once again forced to battle, this time by local Unionist Kentucky militia. Here, Morgan's brother Tom was killed. As the fighting was so furious and the raiders had not yet crossed the Ohio, Morgan was in a bad mood and treated the prisoners cruelly. Also, it was noted by Union commanders that Morgan had left many of the railroad depots intact in his haste. This was clearly not a classic Morgan operation. Union General Edward Hobson of Burnside's division, with 2 cavalry brigades, was ordered to pursue and destroy Morgan. Another general, Arthur Judah, was also set off after Morgan, as well as Mr. Burbridge, Stephen Burbridge. But Morgan had made to Brandenburg, Kentucky, where he was getting ready to cross. So far, it seemed like a normal Morgan operation, except for 3 minor skirmishes with militias, where there was stubborn resistance. On July 9, 1863, Morgan's raiders arrived on the Indiana shore, minus 100 casualties and Morgan's brother, Tom. The last 4 pictures these are all Morgan's brothers here. They were with him on the raid. Shortly after the arrival of Morgan on his command, they began impressing or stealing horses, and there was reported looting of merchant houses. They also began to rob banks. Pillaging may have been a major reason for Morgan's raid in order to replenish his diminishing stores, and everyone knew if it wasn't legal, at least most dubiously acceptable to confiscate enemy property. One farmer claimed that the horse thieves have crossed the river, unquote. 65,000 local militia were mobilized for action. At Corydon, Indiana, Morgan's men met their first resistance since crossing the Ohio on July 11, 1863. Morgan was now fully aware that he was being pursued by Union cavalry, and on July 13th skirted south of Cincinnati, Ohio to avoid a confrontation. Already his men were becoming exhausted by the lightning pace required to avoid capture. Home Guard militias, while they didn't actually fight Morgan's raiders, instead they harassed him by felling trees on roads as they passed. Union gunboats also patrolled the river in hope of catching Morgan, trying to recross. Hobson, who was chasing Morgan, believed that he could now destroy Morgan, quote, once and for all, unquote. One Ohio newspaper reported, quote, Morgan has raided into Ohio and is now trapped here, unquote. Morgan was prevented from crossing into Kentucky sooner because of swollen rivers. At any rate, despite his problems, Morgan was certain that he would be able to escape the Union vice grip and get back to Bragg's army with little trouble. After all, in his daredevil career, he had been in more danger than this. He stated at Portland, Ohio, "The river is only 25 miles away, and tomorrow we will be on southern soil." When Morgan arrived at the ford on the Ohio River, It was in the evening, and he decided to wait until morning. Morgan was confident that he was well ahead of the Union cavalry. Hobson, who was chasing him, however, was about 1 day behind since Morgan left Kentucky, but he had now rapidly closed the gap and probably was only a few hours behind. Too bad Morgan hadn't crossed on the evening of the 1st, after he arrived at the Ohio River ford into Virginia, since it was guarded by only 300 regular infantry, militia, and 2 artillery pieces. Basil Duke, a lieutenant of Morgan's command, blamed the disaster the next day on Morgan's overconfidence or indecisiveness. Had he crossed that evening as necessity dictated, he most probably would have escaped with his command still intact. Whether his exhausted forces could have sustained the pressure of Hobson's and Judah's chase is a matter of conjecture, however. His command had been in a lot tighter spots and had escaped, however. Union cavalry was already closing the gap using steamboats to transport troops and literally living in the saddle. Morgan, who was usually so quick and decisive, seemed hesitant. Obviously, this wasn't the same Morgan who had conducted the Christmas raid. Union forces now were also a lot better equipped, receiving fresh mounts and supplies from local farmers. So, for a period of a few decisive hours, all that stood between Morgan and freedom was 250 militia from nearby Marietta, Ohio, 2 cannons, and a Union gunboat that was not in position to dispute his crossing at that time. Basil Duke, Morgan's second-in-command, stated that General Morgan had decided to let the opportunity pass and to, quote, save all by risking everything, unquote. Morgan stated later that he could easily have escaped by abandoning his wounded and sick and declaring every man for himself, but refused. By 7 a.m. the next morning, it was too late for Morgan. The trap was set, with Union Generals Judah and Hobson in position and the Union gunboat Moose in position to dispute the crossing. The Battle of Buffington Island ensued, and Morgan was unable to cross the river. As it turned out, Morgan abandoned his wounded and artillery and 700 men and fled northward through Ohio, hoping to somehow escape. Basil Duke, Morgan's number 2 man, surrendered here at Buffington Island. About 300 men of Morgan's command escaped at Belleville, West Virginia, but Morgan remained with the main body heading north toward Ohio. After another week of pursuit by General James Shackelford, Morgan was finally captured near West Point, Ohio, 50 miles west of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Morgan had underestimated the Union cavalry, which had greatly improved over the last year, and was somewhat unaware that he was being cut off by Union gunboats on the Ohio. These boats were also ferrying troops, but for a number of mistakes on Morgan's part and some luck, he might have made it back to Virginia or Kentucky. Only a day or two later, the Ohio River was unnavigable when the high water subsided and went back to being 2 to 3 feet deep in many places. Morgan's superior, Braxton Bragg, was outraged when he discovered Morgan had lost 2,100 unreplaceable cavalrymen that were badly needed in Tennessee. This is Morgan's sword he surrendered at New Lisbon, Ohio, after the Ohio raid. Morgan had finally overstretched his daring, and another disaster was something the Confederacy did not need in July of 1863. This is the tree under which Morgan surrendered his command at New Lisbon, Ohio. Morgan's daring raid, however, was a trait admired by some Southerners, despite his complete loss of command. He had taken a chance when it seemed that many Confederate forces were tied down to static, maneuver-type warfare. Here are a few Morgan markers, marking his raid throughout Indiana, Ohio. Here we have John Hunt Morgan, the bold Cavalier. This stone marks the spot where the Confederate General John Hunt Morgan surrendered his command to Major George Rue, July 25, 1863. Morgan and many of his command eventually ended up in the Ohio State Penitentiary at Columbus, Ohio, where living conditions were much better than in the military prison camps of either army at the time. At the Ohio Penitentiary, Morgan and his men, if not existing in good conditions, existed in at least good conditions for the times, playing cards, checkers, sheltered, and able to get exercise. Indeed, one of their biggest complaints was censorship of their mail. Morgan was being held in a cell for convicted felons and subjected to all the punishments and humiliations accompanied with that status. He was determined to break out if he couldn't be exchanged. The Northern government had spent too much time and money to let Morgan be exchanged, however. To rot in prison was the best punishment for a man who lived for action and freedom. Here was a prison suit. A plan was put into action by Morgan's men to escape by cutting through concrete blocks in the cell of a prisoner named Hines and then escaping through an air shaft. The raiders also displayed the ingenuity of later World War II American and British soldiers immortalized in the movie The Great Escape. 6 more escape hatches were dug into the air ducts from other cells, and now the escapees concentrated on where to break out when they got through the air ducts. It was decided the break would put them in a courtyard where a wall had to be scaled, and there were also guard dogs present. Money and other implements for scaling walls were smuggled into them by relatives and possibly some prison guards sympathetic to Morgan. Morgan knew time was short because in a day or two the cells were to be inspected. The plan was set to go, but a rainy evening was needed so that the guard dogs would be in their kennels and not roaming in the courtyard. On November 27, 1863, it rained all day, and Morgan and 6 others made their escape good. John Hunt Morgan had once again slipped through the Northern Yanks, this time at Ohio State's maximum security facility. Only 2 of the escapees were recaptured. Morgan changed clothes and bought a train ticket, eventually working his way back to Tennessee. On learning of the escape, the Richmond Enquirer proclaimed, quote, "The leopard is free," once again. When Morgan finally reunited with his wife, he found out that she had just given birth to a girl who had died shortly thereafter. Morgan wanted to jump right back into the fray after prison and proposed a plan to liberate Kentucky from the Northern grip. However, with 3/4 of his soldiers in Northern prison camps, Morgan was a general without a command. At this time, the Southern Army was nearing exhaustion, and despite Morgan's popularity with the troops, it was not certain whether or not a command could even be found for him. Morgan received some private donations of cash to help him outfit a new command. Later, the Confederate War Department of Richmond decided to re-equip Morgan, since at this time it was in desperate need of his services. Perhaps, with a few more risk-takers like Morgan, the southern states could even hold off the Yankee onslaught. Or maybe it was just what we would call, quote, whistling passing through a cemetery. Note here the threadbare type uniform of this Confederate soldier. This is near the end of the war when their supplies were sadly lacking. Braxton Bragg had been relieved of command of the Southern Army of Tennessee and had been replaced by General Joe Johnson. Johnson was reluctant to part with any soldiers for Morgan's new command despite the wishes of the Richmond government. Johnson was seen more as a bold counter-puncher who waited for the enemy to make a mistake and then pounced on him. Unfortunately for the South, the Northern armies were perfecting their death grip on the Confederacy and making fewer and fewer mistakes. Morgan also had trouble with Braxton Bragg, who now acted as advisor to President Jefferson Davis. Bragg wasn't about to let Morgan forget that he had forfeited highly trained, irreplaceable Kentucky cavalry by his reckless foray into Ohio. Morgan was finally given 2 newly formed Kentucky cavalry brigades and 1 battalion that had served under him. The quality of these troops was not up to par with what Morgan expected of his men. Still, he decided to work with him and tried to bring them up to his standards. Morgan said of these troops, "I have nothing left but a disorganized body of men." Morgan's men were now the dregs of society, and the plundering of private property, rape, and murder occurred too often. With his command restored to 2,000 effectives, Morgan once again made plans to raid into Kentucky. But first, Morgan was forced to battle with Union cavalry under the command of General William Averill. Morgan proved he was still in form, and his command drove the Yankees from the field. Morgan now attempted to re-equip his army by raiding Kentucky once again. Morgan often commented at this time about the poverty and harsh conditions of his command. He hoped for some relief in Kentucky. There were stories of atrocity and drunkenness, rape, pillage, and plunder that were beginning to circulate more and more in regard to Morgan's men. These weren't the same troops that had gone with Morgan initially in 1861. Morgan left Abingdon, Virginia in June 1864 and went through the mountains of the Pine Gap and then into Kentucky heartland. Braxton Bragg expedition, at a time when Morgan's troops would have been of more use to the Confederacy in the Shenandoah Valley, where a devastating Union offensive was underway. Morgan continually gripes about the general quality of his troops, although there were a few able and competent officers there also. Union General Hobson, who opposed Morgan at Buffington Island, and Major General Stephen Burbridge were determined to catch Morgan in a pincher's movement, crushing Morgan's men forever in a vice. Morgan hoped to capture a large stand of Union horses stabled at Lexington, Kentucky, and re-equip his army. Outside Mount Sterling, Kentucky, General Burbridge drew first blood on Morgan's command, but he was driven off. Still, Morgan has sustained almost 300 casualties, which he could little afford. Morgan's raiders now took to robbing banks to obtain cash for supplies. He also proved his potency by capturing his old nemesis, General Hobson, who had chased him during the Ohio raid. He captured General Hobson and his entire command of 600 militia near Cynthiana, Kentucky. Morgan also tore up tracks once again and looted trains. Morgan now turned to confront General Stephen Burbridge's army. Some of Morgan's lieutenants advised him to, quote, take the plunder they had, cut his losses, and avoid confronting Burbridge's 2,400-man regulars, unquote. But Morgan refused. Once again, as at Buffington Island, he was unable to see the limits of his raid. This is the bank vault that Morgan's men cracked open at Mount Sterling, Kentucky. On Sunday, June 12, 1864, Morgan was defeated at Cynthiana, Kentucky, and forced to flee. Burbridge had soundly defeated him. Some of Morgan's men deserted and joined outlaw bands at this time. With the main force still intact but badly depleted, Morgan made his way back to Abingdon, Virginia. Only about 700 of Morgan's original command of 2,000 made it back to Virginia, and due to the depredations and robberies committed by Morgan's men, his reputation was greatly dimmed. Morgan now was ordered to guard the salt works and gather intelligence on enemy movements in southwestern Virginia near Wytheville. His command at this point was demoralized, but Morgan insisted he was ready to strike out on another raid. He proposed a strike near Charleston, West Virginia to tear up railroads, but nothing ever came of it. He also expressed a desire to maneuver in cooperation with General Robert E. Lee's army, but likewise nothing developed. Finally, Union General Alvin Gillum received orders to destroy Morgan's ragged command at Abington, Virginia. Gillum, operating out of northeast Tennessee, had skirmished on numerous occasions with Morgan's men. Morgan's men considered northeast Tennessee as a supply base and stole horses and equipment there. There were some Morgan sympathizers there as well who provided his men with provisions and arms. Morgan was also under pressure from the Confederate government to locate and punish men of his command who had committed bank robbery and murder. Here is a picture of Sue Munday, affiliated with Morgan's command, who had committed some murders and was later tried and hanged after the war. Morgan's physical appearance appeared careworn, and he was bitter at the Richmond government for his accusations. This here is Ferguson, another of Morgan's command who later was involved in robberies and murders. He also was hanged after the war. Morgan sought relief for his problems the way he always had, by action, even though his command was deserting in numbers and rapidly disintegrating. He would prove his critics wrong once again, though, by decisively beating his new Yankee opponent, General Gillem. Morgan left in September 1864 to seek out Gillem into northeast Tennessee. It would prove to be Morgan's last excursion. Gillem was already informed that an encampment of rebels were at Greenville, Tennessee. Morgan was encamped at the home of some Southern sympathizers. Unknown to Gillem, however, Morgan's entire command of 1,500 men were encamped around Greenville. Gillem, however, believed it was probably only a small raiding party. A colonel named Ingerton, attached to Gillem's command, learned that Morgan's entire command was at Greenville, and that Morgan himself was staying at the Williams house. Instead of abandoning the expedition due to being outnumbered, Colonel Ingerton made a gutsy move on his own initiative. Ingerton ordered 2 companies to dash to the Williams house and bring Morgan out dead or alive. Ingerton's men came in with gun blazing, and Morgan was caught totally by surprise. He proclaimed, "The Yankees will never take me prisoner again." Private Andrew Campbell confronted Morgan and ordered his surrender. Campbell was unaware that the man in the blue coat now facing him was John Hunt Morgan. Morgan turned to run, and Campbell shot him through the back. When Campbell learned who he had just killed, he informed his superiors, and Morgan's body was then put on a horse and taken back to the Union lines. This is Morgan's grave in Lexington, Kentucky. His body was moved there a few years after he was killed. Here is a shawl worn by Confederate widows. It's a black shawl that they wore when their man had been killed, and they were in mourning. Here is an actual artifact of Morgan, his shirt. It is said a loud cheer went up by the Union forces when they realized Morgan was killed. The man in the previous picture is the man who killed John Hunt Morgan, Andrew Campbell. This is the house that Morgan was killed right in front of. In closing, it must be stressed that Morgan was a product of the Kentucky frontier military establishment, which developed when Kentucky was a wilderness in the 1700s, with Indian attacks an all too frequent occurrence. Quote, "The best defense was a good offense," unquote. Morgan certainly followed this dictum. Despite his notoriety, he has now been recognized as a native son of Kentucky and even honored with a monument. During the Korean War, the 623rd Kentucky Field Artillery would proudly carry Morgan's flag into combat, which proclaimed the motto Morgan had lived by, quote, "Seize the moment," unquote.